They say trust is like a vitamin. You swallow it every day without thinking, and it keeps you going. I know that now. That for almost 2 years, I thought the thing making me sick was the vitamins. My name is Serena. I'm 31 years old, and I used to be the kind of person who made smoothies at 6 in the morning and left little notes in my husband's lunch bag. I used to believe that if you loved someone carefully enough, quietly enough, they would love you back the same way. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. My husband, I'll just call him my husband, because that's the only title he ever earned, and even that one he stole, was the kind of man people described as solid. Good job, good handshake, good at showing up to things. We met when I was 26, married at 28, moved into a pale yellow house in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, 2 months after the wedding. His sister lived 4 houses down. That detail is important. Remember it. The first time I got sick, it was a Tuesday in March. We'd had dinner as a family. His sister, her husband, my mother-in-law, all of us crammed around our dining table like we did every other week. Roast chicken, green beans, those garlic mashed potatoes my mother-in-law always brought because she knew I loved them. I ate well. I remember that clearly because I'd skipped lunch. By 9 o'clock, my head felt like someone had filled it with wet cement. By 10, I was horizontal, lights off, curtains drawn, my husband sitting on the edge of the bed, patting my hand with the practiced patience of someone who has rehearsed concern. "You've been pushing too hard at work," he said. "You need to slow down." I was a dental hygienist. I cleaned teeth. The most physically demanding part of my job was holding the suction tool for an hour straight. I wasn't exactly running triathlons, but I nodded and went to sleep and woke up the next morning feeling mostly fine, a little wrung out, like a dishcloth someone had twisted too hard. The second time was 6 weeks later. Same dinner. Different potato dish. Same wet cement head by 9. The third time, I brought it up to my primary care doctor. She ran a full panel. Thyroid, iron, B12, cortisol. Everything came back normal. "Maybe you're getting migraines," she said. "Keep a food diary." I kept the food diary. I wrote down everything I ate for 43 days. The only pattern I found was that the bad nights always followed family dinner. I told my husband. He tilted his head the way he did when he was about to explain something to me slowly. "Babe," he said, "you get anxious around my mother. It's psychosomatic." Then he pulled me into a hug that felt like a door closing. His sister was the one who'd introduced us, which I used to think was a romantic detail. She'd been my co-worker for a year. Warm, funny, always bringing snacks to share. She was the maid of honor at our wedding. She cried during the vows. I have the photos. I did not understand then what I understand now, that the people who cry at your wedding can also be the people who plan for you not to be around. But I'm getting ahead of myself. By fall of that year, the bad nights had stretched into bad weeks. I'd wake up after family dinner with a headache, and then spend the next 3 days in a fog, slow, clumsy, forgetting words mid-sentence, leaving my keys in the refrigerator. My husband started using the word episodes. He mentioned it to my mother-in-law. He mentioned it to his sister. He mentioned it, I later found out, to our family doctor, who he'd called separately to say he was concerned about my mental state. I was not mentally ill. I was being poisoned. But I wouldn't know that for another 8 months. The thing that cracked it open was not dramatic. It wasn't a confrontation or a smoking gun or a moment of brilliant deduction. It was the stomach flu. I got the stomach flu in February, and I missed family dinner. Spent the whole evening on the bathroom floor, deeply unglamorous, completely sober, and unimpaired. The next morning, I felt fine, tired and hungry, but the specific fog I'd been dreading wasn't there. No wet cement. No slow-motion Wednesday. I lay in bed that morning and thought, The week after, family dinner came around again. I said I wasn't feeling well. I wasn't lying exactly. I was just leaning into it, and I watched my husband's face do something small and quick that I almost missed. A flicker, not disappointment. Something more like calculation. "You should still come," he said. "My mom made that potato dish you like." He'd never cared before whether I came or not. He'd never once said you should still come. That's when I understood that my being there mattered to someone, and that the someone might not be who I thought. I went, but I didn't eat the potatoes. I loaded my plate with food I'd served myself from shared dishes. The roast, the salad, green beans. I'd watched my mother-in-law pull directly from a casserole dish. The potatoes came separately, pre-portioned into a small dish that his sister set down in front of me specifically. "Your favorite," she said, smiling. "I made extra." I said thank you and moved them to the edge of my plate and spent the meal cutting them into smaller and smaller pieces without eating a single one. That night I felt fine. I didn't sleep, but I felt fine. I lay in the dark next to my husband and ran through every family dinner I could remember. Who brought what? Who served what? Who set what directly in front of me? The potatoes. The potatoes were always the potatoes. Sometimes my mother-in-law brought them, sometimes his sister did, but they always appeared, always in that small separate dish, always presented to me like a gift. I thought about my husband's face when I said I wasn't feeling well. I thought about the word episodes. I thought about the call he'd made to our doctor. I thought about the life insurance policy we'd taken out 18 months ago, the one I'd signed without reading because I trusted him. $250,000. I'd seen the amount on the first page and thought nothing of it because we'd just bought a house and it seemed responsible. I did not sleep at all that night. The next morning, I waited until my husband left for work. Then I went to his home office, the room he kept locked, the room he'd always said was his space, his one thing, and I used the key I'd had copied 3 years ago when I thought I'd lost mine and needed a spare. I'd never used the copy. I kept it in the inner pocket of my winter coat like a small, quiet insurance policy of my own. The filing cabinet opened on the second try. Inside, tax returns, car titles, the mortgage paperwork, and a manila folder with no label that felt thicker than it should have. I opened it standing up because I didn't want to sit down in his chair. Inside was the insurance policy. The beneficiary line had been changed. I knew my name had been there originally. I'd seen it. Now it read his sister's name, listed as business partner and financial dependent. The change was dated 4 months ago. I photographed every page. My hands were not shaking. I think that's the part I keep coming back to, that my hands were completely steady, like my body had been waiting for this, like some part of me had already known and was relieved to finally have proof. I put the folder back. I locked the cabinet. I went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table and thought about what to do next. I didn't go to the police. Not yet. I knew how it would look. A woman who gets headaches after dinner claiming her husband changed the beneficiary on a life insurance policy. There was no body, no toxicology report, no evidence of anything except paperwork that he could explain away with 15 seconds of smooth talking. He was good at smooth talking. He had a whole repertoire of concerned husband language he'd been building for over a year. What I needed was the how, the mechanism. Something that would make a detective stop mid-yawn and sit up straight. I thought about what I knew. The potatoes. The separate dish. His sister, who worked as a pharmacy technician at a compounding pharmacy 20 minutes from our house. I want you to understand what a compounding pharmacy is, because this is the part that closes the logic loop. A compounding pharmacy makes custom medications. They can combine, alter, or repackage drugs to order. A pharmacy technician at a compounding facility has access to a range of compounds that wouldn't be available over the counter. Certain sedatives, for instance. Certain things that, in low repeated doses, cause exactly the symptoms I've been having. Fatigue, cognitive fog, headache, the feeling of moving through water. I didn't know any of this yet. I had to learn it. I spent 3 days reading everything I could about sedative compounds, compounding pharmacies, and medication that could be introduced into food. I am not a scientist. I am a dental hygienist, but I am extremely good at researching things I don't understand, a skill I developed because my husband used to talk over me at dinner parties, and I learned to prepare. On the 3rd day, I found a private investigator through a legal aid referral service. His name was Dennis. He was 62, retired law enforcement, and when I sat across from him in his small office above a dry cleaner's and told him what I thought was happening, he didn't tell me I was paranoid. He asked 3 clarifying questions and then said, "Okay, let's verify." That was the first time in 8 months that someone had responded to me like I was a competent adult. Dennis moved quietly. He spent 2 weeks pulling information I couldn't access, pharmacy dispensing logs, insurance documentation, a financial audit of accounts connected to my husband's name. What he found was methodical and damning, and made me want to sit very still for a long time. My husband had taken out a second policy 6 months before the first one, smaller, through a different provider that I had never signed. His sister was the sole beneficiary on that one. The total payout across both policies was $380,000. Dennis also found email correspondence, recovered through means I won't detail because I don't want to make this about that, between my husband and his sister that discussed timelines and the situation at home and, in one message, the phrase, "She won't connect it to the meals." She won't connect it to the meals. I read that line 4 times. I read it until it stopped meaning anything, and then I read it again until it meant everything. I called Dennis from the parking lot of a Target and asked him what we needed to do. He told me we needed the substance itself. He could document the paper trail, but without a toxicology result or an identified compound, a prosecutor would face an uphill case. We need you to get sick, he said carefully, on purpose, with documentation, or we need to catch them in the act of preparing it. I said, I have a better idea. The next family dinner, I came prepared. I'd brought a salad, spinach, sliced almonds, dried cranberries, my own dressing from home. I set it in the middle of the table and said my mother-in-law's potatoes had been giving me trouble, and I was trying to be more careful about starchy foods. I watched his sister's face when I said it. She smiled and said that was smart of me. Her left hand, resting on the table, went very still. I ate my salad. I ate my salad. I ate from the shared dishes. I left the small ceramic ramekin of potatoes untouched. Before I left that night, I went to the bathroom. On the way back, I paused in the kitchen while everyone was in the living room. I used a small plastic sample container, the kind they give you at the dentist's office for take-home fluoride, and I scraped a small amount from the ramekin. I sealed it. I put it in my coat pocket. I handed it to Dennis the next morning. It took the lab 12 days. The result came back positive for a benzodiazepine compound, specifically a variation used in compounding pharmacies for patients with acute anxiety disorders who can't tolerate standard formulations. It was slow release. It was tasteless. It was, in small repeated doses, exactly what would produce my symptoms. His sister had access to it. His sister had prepared my portion specifically. His sister had prepared my portion specifically. His sister had smiled when she set it in front of me and called it my favorite. I did not cry when Dennis told me. I think I'd used up my crying somewhere in February, in that long sleepless night after the dinner I hadn't eaten. What I did was make a plan. The plan involved 3 things: a family dinner, an elderly neighbor, and a very boring Tuesday afternoon that my husband thought I was spending at a dental hygienist continuing education seminar. My neighbor across the street is 78 years old and has lived in that house since before most of our neighborhood was built. I'll call her my neighbor. She walks with a cane, she grows tomatoes in her front yard, and she notices everything. She had mentioned once that she'd seen my husband's sister's car parked in our driveway twice on weekday mornings when I was at work. She'd mentioned it the way older women in quiet neighborhoods mention things offhandedly while watering her tomatoes, watching my face. I went to her on a Tuesday. I knocked on her door, and she made me tea, and I told her what I'd found. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she put down her mug and said, I knew something was wrong over there. I just didn't know it was that wrong. I asked if she'd be willing to be a witness. Not to anything dangerous, just to be present and to remember what she heard. She said, Honey, I have been waiting for a reason to be useful for 6 years. The insurance investigator was named Walsh. Dennis had contacted him through a referral, and Walsh had been quietly building a file of his own because the policy changes had flagged an automated review 2 months prior. He agreed to attend what I described as a family dinner, introduced as a friend of Dennis's passing through town. I also called a detective with the Columbus PD Property Crimes and Financial Fraud Division. I had the toxicology report, I had the policy documentation, I had the email correspondence. The detective, a quiet, methodical woman who reminded me of no one I had ever met, reviewed the file for 40 minutes and then said, You've done most of our work for us. She didn't mean it as a compliment exactly, she meant it as a fact. The dinner was on a Saturday in April. I cooked everything myself. I told my husband I wanted to host for once, that it would help me feel more normal, that I'd been reading about how routine social connection helped with the kind of fatigue I'd been experiencing. He looked at me the way he always did when I said something that didn't fit his script, a brief recalibration, then the smooth smile. That's my girl, he said. I'm glad you're trying. His sister arrived with a dish of potatoes. She always arrived with a dish of potatoes. I thanked her and set them on the counter and watched her eyes follow the dish and then follow me, watching to see if I'd move them to the table. I did not move them to the table. My neighbor arrived at 6:15. I introduced her as my neighbor and said she'd been kind enough to check on me during the bad weeks, which was true. Walsh arrived at 6:30, introduced as an old colleague of Dennis's. The detective was parked at the end of the street. We ate dinner. My food, from my kitchen, nothing touched by anyone else. My husband was charming. His sister was warm. My mother-in-law talked about a home renovation show she'd been watching. Everything looked, on the surface, like exactly what it was supposed to be. A family dinner, a quiet Saturday, a woman who had been unwell and was trying to get better. Then I set my phone on the table and pressed play. Dennis had recovered the audio. I won't explain how, but there is a recording of a phone call between my husband and his sister from 6 weeks prior, in which she asks how much longer this needs to go on, and he says not much longer. The second policy vests fully in June. And she says she keeps skipping the potatoes when I make them at her place, and he says, then make sure you do it at Mom's, and she says I already switched the ramekin. She doesn't question it when it's separate. The kitchen went very, very quiet. My husband's face did something I had never seen it do. It went completely blank. Not shocked, not angry, blank, like a screen that's lost its signal. His sister pushed her chair back from the table. My mother-in-law looked between her children, and then at me and made a sound that I don't have words for. That's edited, my husband said. His voice was completely level. He looked at me with something cold and focused that I recognized. Finally, for what it was, not love, not even contempt, but assessment. He was calculating. Even now, at this table with everything laid out, he was calculating. It's not edited, I said. Dennis, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, opened a folder and slid a document toward Walsh. Walsh looked at it and said, to the room, that the toxicology report identified a specific compound consistent with the pharmaceutical inventory at the compounding pharmacy where my sister-in-law was employed. I want a lawyer, my husband's sister said. She was not looking at anyone. That's a reasonable thing to want, Dennis said. He said it without any particular expression. My husband stood up. He was still calm. That was the thing about him. He was always so calm. He said, Priscilla, if you've been working yourself into some kind of paranoid episode. My name is Serena, I said. You've called me by my name for 3 years. Use it. The front door opened. The detective came in. She had the warrant. My husband sat back down. My sister-in-law started crying, which surprised me. She cried quietly, the way she had at my wedding, and I sat there and thought about how the same face can hold so many different kinds of tears, and none of them have to be real. Walsh placed both of them under formal investigation before the detective read the Miranda rights. My mother-in-law had not moved. She was sitting with her hands flat on the table, staring at the dish of potatoes still sitting on the counter. And I think she was doing the same math I'd done, running back through every dinner, every ramekin, every time she carried that dish to my house and set it on my table and called it my favorite. She looked at me across the table. She didn't say anything. I don't know what there was to say. My neighbor, sitting at the far end, reached over and put her hand over mine. The legal process was less cinematic than the dinner. It was depositions and continuances and a plea negotiation that took 4 months and made me feel like the inside of a government building for the better part of a year. My sister-in-law's attorney tried, briefly, to argue that the compound could have been introduced at the pharmacy without her knowledge. The pharmacy dispensing records and the specific custom formulation, which had no matching prescription on file, ended that argument before it got any traction. My husband's attorney argued that the insurance policy changes were a financial planning decision, that he had intended to name me as a secondary beneficiary and his sister as primary for estate reasons, that the emails were mischaracterized. The emails were not mischaracterized. The phrase, she won't connect it to the meals, is not a phrase that admits of much creative interpretation. My sister-in-law took a plea. 18 months, served in the minimum security facility, 5 years probation, permanent revocation of her pharmacy technician license. Her attorney presented mitigating factors. I sat in the gallery and watched her accept the terms and thought about every time she had smiled at me across a dinner table. My husband did not take a plea. My husband went to trial. My husband's attorney called me mentally unstable, characterized my investigation as paranoid surveillance, and presented the journal my husband had apparently been keeping, a journal in my handwriting, or something close enough to my handwriting to require a forensic document examiner to distinguish, in which I described feeling overwhelmed, disconnected, increasingly unable to cope. The document examiner testified for 45 minutes. She pointed out 17 specific markers that distinguished the journal's handwriting from my own. She pointed out that the pressure gradient was inconsistent with the grip pattern of a right-hand dominant writer, which I am. She pointed out that the ink on the first 14 pages had a different spectroscopic signature than the remaining pages, suggesting the journal had been created in batches. The jury was out for 6 hours. My husband received 12 years on 2 counts of conspiracy to commit aggravated assault and 1 count of insurance fraud. His attorney filed an appeal on procedural grounds. The appeal was denied. The insurance company voided both policies. The original policy, the one I'd actually signed, was reinstated with me as sole beneficiary, though I'd since changed the coverage to name my parents instead. I sold the house in July. It took 3 weeks to find a buyer, which felt fast, and then I remembered that it was a nice house in a good neighborhood, and the only thing wrong with it was everything that had happened inside it. I moved to a city 2 states away. I got an apartment on the 4th floor with a balcony where I can grow tomatoes, because my neighbor's tomatoes were the first growing thing I'd looked at in a year that didn't make me feel afraid. I changed nothing about my name. I thought about it. I even went as far as looking up the paperwork, but I decided that changing my name felt like letting them take one more thing, and I'd already decided I was done letting them take things. 6 months after I moved, I got a card in the mail from my old neighbor. Inside was a photograph she'd taken from her front yard, our old street in the late afternoon. No people in it, just the pale yellow house, with the door closed and the yard looking exactly like any other yard. On the back she'd written, "It was never the house. You know that. Go live." I put it on my refrigerator. I eat dinner alone most nights, which sounds sad but is actually fine. I cook what I want. I sit at my own table, and nobody brings me anything I didn't ask for. The food tastes like food. This sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. For almost 2 years, every meal came with a question underneath it. A low hum of, "Am I safe right now? Is this the thing that's going to take me down?" That question is gone. I eat dinner and I taste dinner, and when I go to bed, I sleep. The one thing I'll say, for anyone who might be reading this who recognizes any part of what I've described, the fog, the patient husband explaining your own symptoms to you, the feeling that something is wrong, but the wrongness keeps sliding away every time you try to hold it, is this: you are not dramatic. You are not oversensitive. You are not imagining it. The smallest detail is worth writing down. The pattern you can't quite see yet is still a pattern. I kept my food diary for 43 days, and the only thing I found was that the bad nights always followed family dinner. I didn't trust that. I should have trusted that. I should have trusted myself 6 months earlier, and I didn't, because I'd been living with someone whose entire project was making sure I didn't. But I got there. That's the part that matters. I got there. I've thought a lot about what made this possible, not the legal outcome. I mean the thing that had to happen inside me first, before any of it could move forward. For a long time I believed the version of myself that my husband kept presenting back to me: anxious, fragile, prone to making patterns out of nothing. He didn't invent those words from scratch. He found the ones I already half believed about myself, and he sharpened them. That's what made it so effective and so hard to name. He wasn't lying entirely. I do get anxious sometimes. I do notice patterns. He just took those real things and built a cage out of them, and I kept walking back inside because the cage was described to me as safety. The food diary was 43 days of ordinary life, written down in a spiral notebook. I didn't think it would show me anything useful. I thought I was being thorough for the sake of my doctor, who had already more or less concluded there was nothing physically wrong with me. But I kept writing, and eventually the pattern was just there on the page, too consistent to explain away. The bad nights always followed family dinner, every single time. What I did with that information, whether I trusted it or whether I explained it away the way I'd been trained to, that was the moment where everything either continued or stopped. I almost explained it away. I almost wrote anxiety, psychosomatic, my husband is probably right, and closed the notebook. I think about that version of myself sometimes. She was so close. What I want to say about Serena, about me, is that the intelligence it took to get out wasn't the dramatic kind. It wasn't a sudden burst of clarity or a moment where everything crystallized. It was 43 days of a food diary. It was lying awake after one dinner where I hadn't eaten and noticing that I felt fine. It was going back to a filing cabinet I had a key for and choosing to use it. Small decisions made quietly in the middle of an ordinary life that had been slowly rearranged around my destruction. My sister-in-law cried at my wedding. She brought me the dish she knew I loved because she understood exactly what I trusted, and she used it. That's the part that still catches me off guard sometimes. Not the cruelty of it, but the intimacy. You cannot betray someone you don't know well. The people who can hurt you most are the ones you let close enough. That's not a reason to stop letting people close. It's just something worth being honest about. Dennis asked me 3 clarifying questions and then said, "Okay, let's verify. My neighbor said she'd been waiting for a reason to be useful. Walsh showed up and did his job. None of them made my choices for me. They just showed up when I asked, because I had finally decided that asking was something I was allowed to do. The decision to trust yourself after a long time of being told not to, that's not dramatic either. It's quiet. It's just choosing, one more time, to believe what you're seeing. I grew up thinking that endurance meant staying, that loyalty meant absorbing, that love meant making yourself smaller when someone needed more room. I don't think that anymore. Endurance is getting up after the 43rd entry in a notebook and following what you found. Loyalty is something you extend to people who are honest about what they're doing with it. Love does not require you to disappear. My neighbor sent me a photograph of the old street. On the back she wrote, "It was never the house. Go live." I put it on my refrigerator. I look at it most mornings. I eat my breakfast, and I taste my breakfast, and I go to work, and I come home and I cook whatever I want, and none of it is complicated anymore. That's what it feels like when you're finally living in the right direction.